heard Jennifer's story. This is maybe a variation on a theme. This story is in the book, but I probably am not going to tell it the way it is in the book. So literary is an adventure, and oral is another kind of adventure. The ghost came through the wall and through the computer. It was just a little phosphorescent whimsy. A ruffle of molecules, a shift in light, but it was noticeable. Emerging from the wall, going through the machine, coming out again. I turned on the computer to see what had happened, and it came up, it booted up fine. At least I thought so. The ghost came through the wall and through the computer, and I thought to myself, well, it's Chinese computer, but clearly not a Chinese ghost, because in that tradition, ghosts can only move in straight lines and they can't go through walls, because when you're in China and you go into the old houses, you come to the door and there's a wall next to the door, because the ghost would have to turn, and of course it won't turn, so it has to back up. So I don't know quite what this ghost was about, but I didn't pay any attention to it at first. And then the computer began to, how shall I put it? Things began to appear, unbidden, uncalled for. A little of this, a little of that. A text comes up from long ago. The notations or the story of a wedding I had gone to when I was in college in southern Minnesota on an incredibly warm June night. How the best man and Jack and Jack's dog and myself and a couple of other folks left the wedding reception because the best man didn't want to be there when the groom and the bride left. He wanted to be someplace else, anyplace else, because once a man gets married, it's never quite the same. No matter how they say, we will always be those guys. And Jack, as we were driving in the car away from the wedding reception, says, well, I have a wedding present of a sort. And he reached into his pocket and he pulled out a ball of aluminum foil, and when he unwrapped it, it was black hashish from Morocco. And he pushed in the cigarette lighter and pinched off a little bit and dropped it on the cigarette lighter. And they say that drugs kill, and I tell you, when you snort hashish off a cigarette lighter, it kills nose hairs in your sinuses, that's for sure. And then in that moment, the world, the windows had been down, and we had been going through the farm fields, driving past with the corn so green and so yellow in the summer heat. The smell of green, the smell of summer. Things chirping, things croaking. And then in that moment, all of a sudden, it stopped being 3D. It got very silent. The windshield became a flat screen upon which a silhouette of a tree or trees or kinds of trees would appear, and cutouts of corn. And there was no sound. There was just this progression of solid images and colors, one after another. And then the yellow line rose up and began to wave and float above the road, and Mickey Mouse came out from the side, grabbed the yellow line, cracked it like a whip, and it went back into place. And Jack said, well, this is pretty good stuff. I'm reading that text, and I'm thinking to myself, I'm not that man anymore. And then another little bit of text arrives, and I'm reading it with some fear and some trembling. It's from a letter a girlfriend, an old girlfriend had sent me. She was half my age, and that was foolish to begin with. She had said there are 3 reasons why we cannot be together: the difference in our age, the difference in our politics, and the fact I've never been with anyone for longer than 6 months. And I was foolish enough to say the difference in our age can be overcome, the difference in our politics can be ignored. Maybe we can make it around that third hesitation. Huh. But I knew how that one ended, and so I deleted the text. The ghost came through the wall and through the computer. Other things began to appear. Most notably, what began to appear is that when I went to print things out, it would appear randomly, sometimes at the top of the page, sometimes in the text, just these words, "Why am I alone?" And I really did not have an answer for that. I began to observe where it appeared, trying to think, is there some reason? Is there some logic to this? I went back to thinking about that story. You know, when we got to Iota, where we were going to this one particular bar, because the best man wanted to go to that bar because they had piranha in fish tanks swimming back and forth, and he wanted to feed them French fries for some reason. And you know, and we were the kind of guys who, when we arrived at that bar and we walked through the door, a line of farmers who were watching the baseball game at the bar, their heads all swiveled in unison, and they looked at us, and you could hear them say, "College hippies." And they all swiveled back to the baseball game, and we all looked at them and saw them in their summer-stained overalls and their T-shirts. And even though we tried to ignore them, one eye was on them and the other eye was on, the piranha in the tank. Not really fish, but sort of an approximation of fish with their hungry mouths opening and closing and opening and closing like metronomes with those little teeth. And the best man, his mouth was opening and closing, just like theirs. And it didn't seem so much like water as something thick and phosphorescent, as though they were swimming through jello up to the edge, and when they bumped the edge, they would turn and slowly go back. Jack the dog, he was walking around. Jack was one of those dogs who, he actually had a wooden leg, and so he would go thump, thump, thunk, thump, 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 thunk, thump, 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 and back and forth from our table to the door, because he knew this was not a place that we should be. This was not a place he wanted to be. He wanted to be someplace where he could be in the wild, in the night, not with the smell of beer and French fries. I remember the rest of that text from that girl. She was the kind of girl who believed not so much, I won't say it was determinism. What I will say is that she believed that it was a matter of nurture and nature, and those 5 million inputs you have from the moment you're born until whoever you get to, that what should happen would happen, that what must happen was built in from the beginning, from the binary of DNA, from chromosomes, from everything which was their upbringing. Every decision brought you to a moment. And by that logic, the moment I kissed her, everything that would happen did happen. There was no denying it. There was no putting it off. By that logic, but what is nature and nurture? The ghost came through the computer. And the question began to appear, why am I alone? And I began to think about that question. I began to think to myself, why ask it? I began to think about just those words, W-H-I. How odd it is. There on the computer screen, in a vast phosphorescent sea of nothing, this finger pushes that, and a little squiggle appears. W-H-I. By themselves, they're nothing but lines and curves. By themselves, they are nothing at all. And yet they symbolize something, they stand for something, they convey some kind of meaning. They are adaptable. They are inputs. In the computer, it's all ones and zeros, ones and zeros, ones and zeros, ones and zeros, ones and zeros. But when the W and the H and the Y are there, suddenly it conveys a meaning. It conveys a question. Why did we go to that bar? Why did Jack the dog move back and forth? Why did that girl think that at the end of 6 months we would break up? We did. Why did she know we would? Why didn't I know that I should believe her? W-H-Y. Am I? You know, and I began to wonder, perhaps the ghost got it wrong there in that indeterminate state that is not alive and is not whatever is next. Caught in that transition, trying to figure out how or what or why. Trying to figure out what it is that to be not dead, not alive. Trying to figure out who can answer the question, how to answer the question. I. What is I? Ones and zeros. But we're all ones and zeros, aren't we? Not only in terms of the DNA, not only in terms of the chromosomes, not only in terms of the pairing. We're all ones and zeros in terms of atoms in space. Nothing but atoms. I'm atoms, you're atoms, the computer's atoms in space. And yet there's a form to the machine, there's a form to you, there's a form to I. What makes my atoms and my space different from yours? Except for the I, which is the Y, which is the animating spirit, which is the what? And then the computer began to bring up photographs. The first photograph was of a woman who I knew for many years, a close friend, and the picture of her was her at 42 years old, laying on a blanket at a picnic with a radiant smile. But of course she's dead now. And then other pictures began to appear. Some of them marched back in time, some of them simply appeared. My father, my mother, my sister, my daughter. Diane Wolkstein, Ken Veit, Jimmy Young, Susan Gilchrist. People I've known here, people I've known around the world, all dead. And yet when the picture came up, they were as much real and alive to me as any time they had actually been in the world. The memory of them was so real. It is said that if you can remember the name, someone is not really dead. And I said to the computer, I said to the ghost, bring them on. Bring them on. My cousin Darryl, Brother Blue, one after another. My grandparents, the picture of my grandparents, my grandmother is leaning against sitting on the running board of a 34 Ford. My grandfather is standing next to her. We have the same mustache. We have the same slouch. His hair is better than mine. He died before I even knew him. And I look at that picture and I go, yes. Yes. The ghost came through the computer, the ones and the zeros. Why am I alone? And I begin to think perhaps that's not the right question. Maybe it's not a question. Maybe just as the words appear separately in each corner of the page, maybe I'm reading in the wrong way. Maybe it is I alone. Why am? Any number of ways you can read it, it comes down to the same thing. In this moment, meaning arrives, not necessarily on its own, but because we give it value. My memory, my desire, my wanting to make that moment where the piranha bump up against the glass real. It means nothing, and yet, why not have it mean something? In what way am I like the piranha? In what way am I like Jack the dog? In what way am I like my grandfather? In what way am I like you? I go to delete the text, and I decide not to. The ghost came through the computer. It was a little bit of phosphorescence. It was a little shimmer of light and molecules and air. It was an invitation. It was a challenge. It was a gift. It was